I don't want to take away any of our time from the Fireside Chat, so I'll keep the introductions brief. But we are so happy to have Biju Kulathakal here, the CEO of Halo Investing and proud Illinois Tech alum. Let's have a shorthand for Biju. And interviewing him will be Professor Matt Dixon, professor here at Illinois Tech. So let's have another hand for Matt Dixon. We'll be having a majority fireside chat, and there will be time for audience Q&A at the end. And so feel free to think of any questions you have to come up and ask our guests. And here is your microphone back.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us. And can you all hear okay? Perfect. So thanks, Biju. And I think just to get started, we're going to before we get into the sort of the details of your own personal journey, can you tell us a little bit about what Halo Investing does and what's the roadmap for the next 5 years?
Great. Thanks, Matt, and thank you all for this opportunity to be here. So Halo is a company me and my co-founder started about 7 years ago. We're headquartered in Chicago, but we have offices around the world, and we operate around the world too. We truly are an international company, with more than a third of our business being outside the U.S., but Chicago-centered, Chicago-headquartered, and IIT alum. So that's very very proud of that. But Halo at the end of the day is a platform for this product called structured notes. And what is a structured note? A structured note is a way for investors to get access to the market, to basically invest in the stock or commodity or foreign exchange market. But with some sort of protection, some sort of structured protection on the downside. So we sell this to investment advisors, so people who manage other people's money, both in the United States and around the world. And in a basically a very short time, probably about this in 7 years, we've become one of the biggest players to do that, the biggest independent player to do that globally. Most of the other folks doing this are very large banks. We partner with some of the world's largest banks. We're tied into 35 of the world's largest banks today as issuers on our platform, but selling to investment advisors. So this was traditionally done by very large global banks. And we've expanded the pie to be just outside of these banks. And that's the traditional talk of fintech, right? That's storybook fintech. And basically, there are a lot of these, we have these global banks. They do some great stuff, but they have a lot of these different things housed under one roof. And we're finding very often that, hey, we can do innovation sometimes a lot faster, a lot more tech-focused, outside of the bank, but still increase the pie of financial services globally by doing that. And that's sort of the quick rundown on Halo. And being an engineering grad from IIT too, I'll say with Halo, I say we're fintech, but more tech than fin. And that's basically emblematic of what you're going to see in finance globally. So you see Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, basically said that. With incumbent banks, they have very large balance sheets, but it's hard. It's hard for them to do some of the innovation, because it's hard sometimes to be the incumbent, do everything you're supposed to do to keep the business running, but also to be nimble and flexible enough to do innovation. And we're finding that this innovation is very tech-focused, very tech-centered, and I think in that the technology background that folks at universities like this and around the world really have an advantage to change how these markets operate.
Thanks. That's really interesting, and I appreciate that intro. So I think for the benefit of everyone here, how many of you have sort of a technology background, an engineering background of some sorts? Okay, great. And how many of you know anything about finance or have a finance background? Okay, so maybe 70-30 or something like that. So let's ask a question about technology entrepreneurship and why fintech is kind of an interesting, unique animal. What do you need to be a great fintech entrepreneur as opposed to a self-driving car startup. What's the sort of the magic ingredients that make something like that work?
Yeah, so I'd say to be an entrepreneur in any field, right, you have to understand finance in some way. Like, so I'd say the three things to be an entrepreneur in any field, regardless of what your field is. Like, you need to know how things work. Okay, you need to know how money is allocated and managing finance, because a lot of entrepreneurs sometimes underestimate the value of that. Money at the end, it's just this big accounting system for allocating resources. That's all it is, right? So, but you have to understand this accounting system, because if you don't, it's hard to be. You have to be able to raise capital. You have to manage sales. You have to know what to do with your sales. And so finance is important for any technology entrepreneur to understand. And I think the third part in being a good entrepreneur is you have to know how to attract and lead people for a bigger cause, right? So those, I would say, three biggest components. And then, I have a degree in aerospace engineering, so not a financial background per se. So I don't think you need to have a degree in finance to do anything in finance. And that's borne out more and more in this world. So when I was at IIT from 1994 to 98, and in 96 I got into finance because I got a internship with a big options market making firm in Chicago being the center of options market making. And it was so interesting because I saw and I was kind of witness to a transition in the markets, because when I started interning for them, there were, as you've seen these pictures and movies about people on the trading floors making markets. And those guys were just all about finance, not about tech. And that's the kind of company I walked into. That's the kind of industry I walked into. You see all these people wearing multicolored jackets, making all these markets with hand signals, right? That was their TCP/IP, hand signals, right? That's how they were communicating with each other. And literally they had different hand signals to communicate prices, different hand signals to communicate what they wanted, whether they want to buy or sell. And you went from that to literally you could see this world changing. In 5 years, it really became the folks who were really best at it were the folks who were programming computers, who knew it was not Python back at that time, but it was something else. And then, but with the guys who knew how to program those computers and were create algos. And just 5 years before, the ones who dominated in the field were the guys who sort of had the biggest muscles to muscle out the other guys. So you saw this transition, and that's basically what finance became. Finance really became all about tech. And it was like Mark Andreessen said, software is eating up the world, and basically software is eating up finance too. It's basically every aspect of finance then really just became more about tech. And you'll see this right now too. Everyone hired at a trading floor is somebody who's doing an algorithm, not somebody who's doing something else. It's born out more and more in this world, and it's at the biggest banks. But you also start seeing big aspects, big verticals in finance being taken outside of the banks, and somebody outside of the bank in lending, payments, different aspects of capital markets. And all these players are making the world more efficient, in addition to what the banks are doing.
So thanks for sharing that. And I think, you mentioned that you were a student here, and actually I wanted to take that further and just, for the benefit of the students here, I want you to cast your mind back to when you were here, 20-something-year-old. The world's your oyster, the future ahead. And just imagine now that you could speak to yourself as you were then. What advice would you give to yourself in terms of embarking on a career in the area of fintech? Is entrepreneurship, startups for everybody? Should they go and work for a little bit for a company before deciding? Is there a well-defined pathway for someone, given that you've been through that yourself? How would you kind of share your experience and your success?
Yeah, I'd say so. A couple of things. I hope startups are just as important, in the world's GDP as they are now, and maybe even more important going forward, right? And I hope everybody can be involved in a startup in some way, right? But being, everyone does not have to be a founder. Everyone does not have to be, you don't have to be the founder of a startup to really make a difference. I think the most important thing is what impact you make, in the world, and you don't have to be a founder, because I think too often we glamorize founders too much in the world, with movies like The Social Network and all this other stuff, right? It's like we just think it's about, being on Forbes covers and movies. But I would say for everybody, like it's not that. It's really more about what everyone makes an important difference in a startup, and to be a founder per se, like you have to be a little bit crazy, and I think it's a necessary ingredient for someone to be a startup founder, because it's not. It has a lot more to do with taking on risk and handling different situations than about being smart. But one of the cool things for me at IIT too is that IIT had a very international crowd, so I was exposed to just a lot of different cultures and experiences being here. That definitely helped. That diversity definitely helped shape my thoughts as a founder of a startup. That was one. Two is then being so close to a big city like Chicago, because a lot of what you do as a startup founder, like, you can't plan for it. You just have to be open to random experiences. That's really what happens at the end of the day, because if anybody told you they were doing, they knew they were doing exactly this, that would not be true, and you'd be closing your mind to a lot of other things. So the great thing about being at IIT was that I think the exposure to everybody with a very technical, but also like this drive to change the world in some way was very interesting. And two, being close to a big city like Chicago was very interesting, and that just brought a lot of really good things in my experience as a startup. So I did, my degree was in aerospace engineering. So it's not what anyone had planned. I thought I'd be working for NASA or Boeing, at some point. But then I think you just have to sort of have to let the opportunity take you, then have an exact plan. And so I happened to meet some folks in finance who had a specific problem they needed to solve, and in solving that problem is sort of how a startup came about. And I think that's what everybody should do.
Well, that's great advice. And I think you mentioned a number of interesting points there about being exposed to an international community, and then just sort of getting hands-on with a problem and letting that sort of, submerge you. And in fact, let's talk a little bit more about fintech and some of the barriers to entry for fintech, especially for millennials, Gen Zs, who really want to make an impact in this world. Sometimes, I've had several students say to me, why do I want to make a rich person richer? How does that make me feel good inside? Given that finance has really shifted in the last 5-10 years towards ESG and other areas of socially impactful investing, can you speak to a little bit about why, in fact, the fintech industry does align with the values of our younger generations?
Absolutely. So one of the key things with finance too, what's the purpose of finance? What's the purpose of these markets, right? At the end of the day, they're about allocating resources, and if you can allocate resources more efficiently, you reduce cost for everybody. You increase impact for everybody, and that's the way I've always looked at it, from the very beginning. And I think ultimately, and this is not just for everyone in Gen Z, but even everybody working at our company, right? It's the why of fintech that's more important than the what of fintech. So in that front, ESG is one term that's encompassing, that's basically becoming a bigger thing in fintech than any other term, because if for all these banks and the big fund companies and the big, financial product companies like the BlackRocks and all of the world, right? Everyone's focused on everyone is coming out with some specific ESG strategy. I was just with the CEO of a very global bank, one of the largest banks in America, over the weekend, and he just said that ESG is going to be, they're working on a big ESG strategy where ESG is going to be a competitive advantage to them over every other bank. And this is a bank CEO. This is not like, an energy CEO. This is not the CEO of ExxonMobil. It's not the CEO of, some other firm. This is a bank CEO, and I think that's so true. Like, something we're looking at, we're in one of the biggest energy transitions of our time, and if you don't know and this affects, and finance affects every aspect of it, right? From financing the old fossil fuel companies to financing the new energy companies, and in that transition, every transition there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of opportunity to help the incumbents move off the traditional source of energy to helping new entrants transition to the new source of energy. So in these transitions, right, there are huge opportunities for fintech in lending, in payments, in the markets for these commodities. That's what I think all these all students and everyone playing in finance care about.
Great. So basically, everyone needs money, and you can help them do the right thing once they have that money to transition to more environmentally sustainable, as ESG is an environmental sustainability initiative. If you're not familiar with that, so let's step back a little bit, and we're here in Chicago, not such a sunny day, but let's talk about how it is that Chicago, in many ways, is a real potential, has a huge potential as a fintech center. What are your thoughts on how Illinois tech can position itself as that, sort of starts to spell out? I mean, if you go to the West Loop right now, it sort of feels a little bit like sort of Silicon Roundabout in London or Silicon Valley. It's got a very sort of Google sort of energy about it. Do you think that's how the fintech community sort of grows from that sort of on the ground, sort of ground roots sort of activities? How does IAT play into that?
That's great. So, so a couple of things, right? If you look at Chicago historically, it's always been a great center to attract people who manage risk in some ways, right? Like if you look at Chicago way back, I mean, if you look at, I just saw this over the weekend. I forget what it was. Maybe it was TV or YouTube, but there's something about the World Exposition, right, in Chicago. It was like 130 years ago, 140 years ago. But if you look, they built this whole freaking city not too far from here in 2 years. They built this in 2 years, right? And they dismantled the whole thing 6 months later. But like, again, building it up and dismantling it like so fast like that sort of innovation, right, was in a city like this. And if you look at the exchanges, most of the exchanges created here, right, the Merck, the CBOE, the Border Trade, right, these were centers for people trading risk. So we were really good at trading risk, and basically, it's not trading risk just for Chicago. This is not trading risk just for the USA. This is trading risk for the world, right? And this is, just give you a statistic. Even today, 70% of the world's market cap, of all the stock exchanges in the world, right? If you basically look at the market capitalization of all the stock exchanges in the world, 70% of that is U.S. So 70% of the value of all the world's public equities is U.S. based. And when we do this, because our business is very international, so when we have customers in Switzerland or Germany or mainland Europe or South Africa or Asia or the Middle East, when they're trading these products that we create on our platform, They're trading something with the U.S. They're trading the S&P 500. They're trading Apple, Tesla, right? We don't trade, we don't trade Tencent and Baba as much as they trade Apple and Tesla, right? So we've really built something big here, and when that market that we built that's so big, when we transfer risk, when we buy options on them, when we transfer risk, basically these options and futures are just a way to transfer risk from one investor to another. And we've traditionally had a big center to do that, through these physical places. And now all that transference of risk, the centers to do that, the actual transactions are happening on computers. But the IQ for it, there's still a lot of that IQ for it here. With the biggest prop trading firms in the world are all Chicago-based. So what we find is looking and hiring for that talent for the next generation of what that frontier of risk transference is. It's kind of what we are in a certain way too. So maybe we have a natural, tune to this market. We find that hiring the talent is really good here. And also in that talent, right? So we're always looking for, we're not looking for big traders. We're looking for people who understand math, people who are good with technology. And that tech talent, I think IIT has a natural position to do that. And I think we need to develop that more too. So I think people would think finance is just about math, but actually finance is more about tech than it's about math. There's a lot of math, so they always think the future of finance is just math. It's not just math. It's really a lot of tech. It's programmers who figure out interesting ways to develop these systems. It's about the user experience. It's about all these calculations, but it's not. It's transition from not just being about pure numbers to being somewhat math and algos. But when it comes to algos, it's really more about, hey, how do you program these systems to create the best markets for it? And also, how do you program these systems to create the best user experience for customers? The winning strategy for us and a lot of other players in this is the user experience. So we do that, and I think in that way, we've got a natural advantage here. And but I also think Chicago is center for this. In some ways, also underappreciated. People don't realize when they look at creating the next startup for finance, they don't really think about, hey, Chicago as that place. And we need to do a better job of promoting that.
I think we probably still have a good 10, 15 minutes. Okay, great. So I'm actually going to sort of switch gears slightly here and kind of throw some hardballs at you since you've so kindly come down to join us.
Great.
And I think the purpose of these is really just to sort of expose some insight. I think that's what we're looking for here. So I think do you have children?
I do.
And what age are they?
5 and 7.
Okay. And I don't know if you've had that conversation, but how do you tell them what daddy does? Just kind of interested. What's the...
It's really hard, right? Because it's hard for me to go to a dinner party and tell people that what I do, because when I say structured notes, I lose everybody, So it's so that's hard in itself. So it's hard to explain then to a 5 and 7-year-old. And I've always had that problem, like when one of the previous companies I co-founded was a company called Redbox in the movie rental business. And telling a 5 and 7-year-old today that one day we used to consume our media through these discs, is a hard concept for people to get through. Like I had my 5-year-old when she was 3. She went to we mostly consumed media through iPads and things like that. She went to we went to our in-laws' house, and she went to my so we didn't really keep TVs around the house. She went to my in-laws' TV and tried to swipe it, and realized it doesn't work that way. So, I think I think right now I still haven't figured out how to explain that to my kids. To be totally honest, they just know I work at a place that has like cool freebies like this that I bring home once in a while. But I think overall though, I think at a certain point, I think it's more, I just want, it's more important for them to understand certain aspects of technology, because what is going to be the cool financial problem to solve when they are 20 or when they're 25, right? Could be simply completely different than what exactly we are solving right now. And in fact, I hope it is, because if we've solved it, then it is a different problem. And if we haven't solved it, it's still going to be the same problem, right? So.
Yeah. So these are completely sort of random questions. There's no relation to this next question to the previous one. So actually, you've mentioned a lot about global positioning and global markets. We're seeing the rise of China. We're seeing the colossal growth of countries like India. How does, in the next 5 to 10 years, how does Halo Investing position itself in the global market with regard to trends in tech, workforce, and growth of countries?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. I can answer that from the standpoint of markets, but I also can answer that from the standpoint of talent. So one is from a market standpoint, right? Like you see everything that's happened with the pandemic and with Russia, and people say it's the end of globalization, right? I disagree. I disagree that it's the end of globalization. I think globalization will go through hiccups, just like everything with the market cycle will go through hiccups, but it's not the end of globalization. I mean, we're only going to be more globalized just because it makes sense from a technology and other standpoint. It makes sense. It's not going to be in any other way. So, and we'll always have some bumps in the road, right? So that's okay. In fact, like we truly are a business, and from the beginning, we thought about our business as being global. Like from the beginning, we'd go to global markets and pitch to different folks. Our largest two investors are from outside the country, and also some of our biggest clients are from outside the country. So that's helped us having this global perspective from the very beginning. So I think every startup and even every big company, right, they just need to figure out how to adapt to a different global market, then bet on globalization being dead, because I think if you bet on globalization being dead, you're going to be wrong, right, on that. The other thing is talent. So one thing from a talent standpoint, right, the best minds, like hiring where you think the best minds are only going to come from the United States is like hiring like you think the best minds are only going to come from Illinois, right? Like, and that's not the case. Like we've truly hired from a national and global perspective. And in fact, 2/3 of our headcount is US based, the remaining 1/3 is non-US based. And we don't do that, we don't really do that for cost or anything like that, because sometimes costs are different in different countries, but it actually takes more resources here to manage it. We do that because of diversity. And why is diversity important? Diversity is important not just for some ESG statement. Diversity is important because we truly get different ideas from people in different places than we do from if all our talent was sort of US based alone. And that has really helped us. So we've I think globalization, both in terms of the markets we serve and who we hire to serve them, is just going to be a bigger and bigger trend.
So I think we've got 2 more minutes, or we've got time for 2 more questions or so. And I think you mentioned the diversity aspect being very important, and that's certainly something which I think IoT is obviously embracing as a community, and still thinking ahead about how to actually achieve that. And when it comes to diversity, how does that actually manifest on the ground? Right down to every person who works in the organization. I mean, we're talking more than just sort of diversity of investment here. We're talking about diversity of cultural values, different ethics, different religions, and they all got to come together, and we've all got to get on and respect each other. On a day-to-day, how does that play out? And what are some of the learning points that you've taken away from having to sort of institutionalize something like this?
Yeah, so one thing is when we look at our product, right? Our product is only as good as the customers who interact and give us feedback for that product. And having a product that would be only US based is different than having a product that truly is global, because we get feedback now from around the world in what we need, and we see trends that we wouldn't have seen in the US, and we see trends that we can bring to the US, and we see trends and ideas that we can export from the US to other places. So that's from your product basically being a combined, aggregation of feedback from all your customers. That is really manifested in how global we have this product. So we sell to advisors and money managers both in the U.S., international. So our customers in Switzerland want something very different, but also still want something that's very much the same. So. But that difference, that last 20 or 30% that they want different, actually helps our U.S. customers with product ideas they otherwise would not have seen. And then the other thing from that diversity standpoint is your talent. So when your talent is truly global, we get ideas from our offices internationally that we just don't get at the same way from a U.S. standpoint. So we do a lot with content that's also very international and not just US based. And that really gives us a leg up to anybody else who's our competition, who's just in one specific country.
So, and I'm going to ask my favorite question because I'm a bit of a sort of AI sort of geek, and I'm also think that the blockchain is very exciting. And so when most people think of fintech, they typically now think as a tech entrepreneur, okay, I've got to do something with AI, or I've got to do something with blockchain. What would you say to them in terms of, is that what's out there that they can't see? If you're coming to this with a technology background, trying to leverage these technology drivers like AI and blockchain, from your perspective, what are some of the opportunities out there that aren't so obvious to someone who's got their Silicon Valley hat on?
Yeah, so you see people using AI and blockchain as catchwords for a lot of things. Sometimes just for higher short-term valuations or for getting the door somewhere. But at the end of the day, right? I mean, again, two technologies. So we basically are a platform that does something with issuing these corporate bonds. That's what these structured notes essentially are. They're like corporate bonds that used to be issued in this very clunky, traditional way, which had very high overhead costs for every bank issuing it. And we've got some projects using blockchain because blockchain fundamentally is a better technology to do that long term. So I think, and that's a key thing is, okay, if there's some key efficiency or productivity gain you're going to get from that, that's really all it is. There's no magic in blockchain. There's no magic in AI. As long as you're going to get efficiencies from that, which is what we're seeing. Where in AI we're doing some things with related to content, where how we produce content, and also there are things we're doing with AI where some of our products basically, we have to digest so many, tens of thousands and millions of legal documents of how we understand, how we take out key phrases and key points, data points from these docs, and we use AI to do that. But I think the lesson, at least for us, portable to anybody else, is that hey, as long as there's a long-term advantage to doing it, you have to use it, and also cement yourself in some way in the industry by using that as an advantage. But there's a lot of short-term keywords, and that itself doesn't go anywhere.
Great. Well, I think we've just got maybe, how many more minutes do we have left?
Just about 20 minutes left.
Okay. Yeah. So I think now would be a good time to open up the questions to the audience, and so I think we'll if you're open to that, just
Sure.
Can I start? Thank you. That was great. So right before we started this session, I was talking to Matt about, you know, his concerns with his staff and just sort of keeping everybody aligned on the vision of the company. That's hard to do at a very small scale when you're just starting your company. You just raised a significant round of funding, and I'm assuming that your headcount is about to multiply by double digits.
Yes.
And so I'm interested in hearing about how your hiring strategy has changed, and what, if anything, are you most concerned about as you're getting ready for hypergrowth?
For sure. Thank you. So I think the key thing, key thing about retaining people and hiring in general, right, is that, a lot of people, it's interesting, a lot of people take a pay cut of some sort to come to us, okay, because we give these stock options, we care about everybody getting stock in some way, and we care that it's we have the right long-term incentive for people from both cash and stock and all these other things. But the one thing we've always found is it's really important to establish the why of what the company's doing. And if that why is not strong enough, right, the why are we doing what we're doing, and we kind of call it our North Star. So basically every initiative in the company has to tie into like a couple of North Stars. And you can't have too many North Stars because it's too confusing, but you have to have one key North Star. So for us, our North Star is basically, hey, we are a lot of retail investors in the world are basically investing in the markets without protection. So people are doing, playing with like the Robin Hoods of the world, which I think is fundamentally bad for you, and to just like treating the stock market like a giant casino, which is also, this is which is bad for you. This is supposed to be your retirement savings vehicle, right? So we want to fundamentally change how people invest for retirement and their retirement and other major life goals. And explaining that why to people, before it was me and my co-founder doing that all the time when we interviewed people. Now we have a bigger team, but if we transmit those values, and doing that when we are hiring, it is so critical to attract and retain people. Now we have this kind of crazy thing right now as a result of the pandemic and some of the other monetary policy things we've done, in the last 2 years, right? Like the U.S. compared to other OECDs has had one of the lowest labor force participation in the last 2 years, and which is why hiring everywhere has been like off. It can't be like this forever. It's not a long-term sustainable thing. But even going through those headwinds, we've been very lucky, but also beyond luck, it's also that we've been so focused on the why and attracting the long-term talent and making decisions for the long term in terms of hiring and not just moving with short-term blips. Because to your point, we have to dramatically increase our headcount to get the right people, but we're not trying to sell this company tomorrow. We want to build something for the longer term. So we are still working really hard to attract people who care about the why of what we're doing. Does that make sense? I mean, I'd say the biggest thing for us is, it goes back to hiring. The thing I maybe lose the most sleep about. Like, we know what we want to do. We just need more people to do it, right? And the biggest concern there is, hey, how do we just need to keep evolving our strategy, okay, in this hiring process. We try different things, and we've had really good, we're hiring, 10 or 20 people a month, and which is a lot. I think we're about 200 people right now. And so we look at different things, like, okay, if we can get this aspect of the tech team here, can we get it at one of our, overseas offices? So we always strategize and change different things like that. And as the world changes, it also changes, where we can get that down. We actually used to have from a human talent perspective, we used to have an office in Ukraine, like, 3 years ago, and we just didn't have enough people there, so we wound it down the end of last year, and we thought, okay, this year we were going to revamp our Ukraine efforts and things like that, and it didn't happen for obvious reasons, but yeah, I mean, like for us, it's about we'll just go anywhere in the world where people exist and they understand our markets to get that talent. So it's, for me, my biggest concerns are always about talent, where to source the best ones from.
Right, so one final question about that. So which markets are best for fintech talent other than Chicago, of course?
So it's interesting, even in fintech, there are so many different segments of fintech. So fintech is a very broad word, right? And so we find that for certain things in fintech, we can get that talent mostly in London. Certain things in fintech in Zurich, certain in Singapore, and even there's a lot of segmentation we do. A lot in Chicago. We try to make everything, all the talent we can. We're very like, we like people who can be in Chicago. So as much as we can, we try to find people in Chicago, just because we want people to come into the office and all that. But some of this other talent is only global. There are certain parts of exotic derivatives trading that we're finding the talent to be much easier in London than anywhere else in the world, literally anywhere else in the world. There are some aspects of with development too, right? If you look at different aspects of the dev stack and of the tech stack, we're finding certain back-end engineers are better here, certain front-end engineers are better there. So we're finding that geographical specialty. So it's literally all over. It depends on what we're going after.
Hi, Biju. Thanks for your time today. I appreciate the sharing with the audience. As you know, I worked at BlackRock during the 80 to 800 person hypergrowth phase. A lot of the lessons from that were operational risk and redefining new forms of things that weren't measured at all. So two things going on in the world right now. Pandemic taught us for 40 years supply chain was messed up because people didn't look at the opportunity costs of just-in-time inventory. We learned. We know what the problem is. We might not have fixed it yet. But then the other thing you just talked about was ESG. If you put 20 people in a room, right now you're going to get 20 definitions of what ESG is. So to me, I just wanted to go down deeper into that ESG rabbit hole. What do you think? What conversations do you think need to take place to create greater consensus around that so that it can operationalize and scale? Just curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, and to be fair, right, the reason we get 20 different answers about ESG is because there are more than 20 different problems that need to be solved with ESG, right? It's sort of like, hey, what specific thing can you solve? Like, even if you look at energy transition, energy, so much of our GDP, so much of the global GDP goes to energy. But in transitioning that, right, there are so many different aspects to it, right? Like whether you're going off coal to natural gas or natural gas to, to solar and wind and nuclear or something like that, right? So many different things, so many different problems. But I think what everybody will, and every company, even you don't have to be a company in the energy space itself, but every company, by virtue of energy and by consuming these other things, has an ESG exposure. I mean, even Microsoft, Amazon, all these guys like Microsoft, right, has huge ESG exposure. Like, people don't realize it. People just think of the Exxon Mobils and the Shells as having ESG exposure, but all these guys. So I think the focus for different for different people will be different. But I also think that as solutions, the other problem is, like, right now the world, forget what we're doing from an ESG finance standpoint, but just from an ESG action item standpoint, even if you look at the COP26s, and then you'll see COP27, COP28, the COP26 is the big climate change conference, right? You see that even there's very little consensus today of, hey, exactly how we're going to handle this transition. And so I think that's why I think finance is a little bit like that, but I think it'll crystallize and distill around a few topics really soon in the next 3 to 4 years. I think as the real world changes, then finance itself will change in terms of, hey, how do we finance these transitions? Because if these transitions are not financed, there won't be a transition.
So what you're saying is fintech is integral to addressing climate risk.
It is a very big part of addressing climate risk, and if we don't, and I think the solutions for addressing climate risk will not come from just the incumbents, will come from some of the fintech players. You see that in how they are reporting, calculating exposure to climate risk among different companies, in terms of carbon credits, carbon offsets, things like that, and then you're going to start seeing more of that with fintech companies.
Just introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name's Jay, and I'm an IIT student. I'm studying data analytics and management. I had a very different question than what has been discussed before. I wanted to know, when you look at the del curve, the change curve over a couple of years that has happened, that has been going on with the company, you see there's a lot of growth that has been happening. So what did you do to make sure that the growth, is consistent? And what were the hardships, the failures that you experienced initially? And what did you do in order to change them for your own good? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing for a startup in terms of growth, right? Like, you're always at war. You're not at peace. You're at war, right? You're always at war. So, what does war mean? Like, if you're looking for this change, you're looking for this change in the world, which is so different from the status quo. There are always a couple of things you have to change in the short term, but then aim for the long term. So I think the key thing for growth, right, is that you always have to be willing to make big, bold bets. Right, that's, I think, one of the key things. It sounds like I don't know if this sounds too easy or obvious, but it's not. But I think when you lead teams, you always have to make a couple of key, big, bold bets. I think the reason this growth, I mean, let's look at it a different way. Why does this not happen at a very large company or a very large bank, or Because one thing I've noticed at those places is that there's a big emphasis on consensus, right? And one of the key things at a startup is that you have to bet on there not being consensus. So if you really want growth, you need, I always say, like, if everyone agrees with an idea, it's probably, there's not a lot of growth in it, So you have to be able to manage a culture where there's a good amount of disagreement. And if you have so I always say, like, if you take 20 people in a room, right? And if you say something's a good idea and everyone agrees with it, it's probably late, okay? Maybe if everybody disagrees with it, maybe it's a bad idea, or maybe they're not seeing anything. But, like, I always find the best ideas where, like, half the people agree, the other half disagree, right? And then there's basically what that means is it's non-obvious, right? The ideas with the biggest alpha, so to speak, are the non-obvious ideas. So I think this applies whether you're a small startup or a big corporation. I think it's a universal rule. You have to look, because this happens at small startups too. I mean, don't get me wrong, it happens at small startups too. You have to look at the non-obvious to bet on, and that's where there's alpha. Because when you bet on consensus, right, it's sort of like betting on the S&P 500. You have the S&P 500, but there's no alpha in it. If you really want alpha, you have to bet on something that's different from the main index.
Hello, I am Kathit, and I'm an IIT student as well. I'm from finance. I just wanted to ask you specifically, what are some specific differences in the way you manage the company before receiving the funding versus after receiving the funding?
Well, we've always received funding in some form, right? It's just like this the last form of funding than now. I think one thing that happens is it's not so much the funding, it's just more like growth, which we've always been growing. And you just grow at a faster pace. So I just say it's sort of like, and you always have to like, it's very normal to have like a high degree of chaos and a high degree of, and a need to like reorg yourself almost every 3 to 6 months at the rate we are at, you know, because I say it's like we're a company that's growing like, you know, 3 pant sizes every month, you know, it's like that. So you have to buy new clothes, right? So we do that. So I think the key thing is we try to just put in more organization, which just keeps changing. Like we don't have the organization structure of just a very large bank, because a very large bank, you're going like 5 to 10%. When you're going 100 to 300%, whatever you think is organized well will be different 3 to 6 months from now. So that's what we keep changing, and we don't know exactly what it should be until we actually go through that. And that applies to any startup too. And I think maybe a lesson I've learned on that is, I mean, when you're at the size we are at, any org deficiencies you have are just very obvious. Sometimes when you're smaller, you may not be organized well, but you don't see the deficiencies as, you know, you don't see, it doesn't, you know, hit you in the face as much. So sometimes I've always felt I could have done some of that before it actually like hit me in the face, but you know, we live and learn.
Hello, my name is Shruti. I am a marketing analytics student. When we see that you've raised such an amount of funding, the first thing that strikes that I think if somebody is from a startup world is, how did you convince the investors? And I know they're there to invest, but how do you make them believe in your idea, and why yours versus the competitors that are in the market?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, when it comes to raising money, right? People always think, do you raise money because someone like your spreadsheet, you know, better than everybody else's spreadsheet? But it's not the case, not at all. Like, in fact, the first connection point with people, you know, it's really like they have to empathize with you. So it's more about empathy and some sort of connectivity. Like they have to like you. They're really betting on you as a person than your business model and your numbers for now. You know, that's just the truth of it. So they're really betting on you, and the connectivity is more personal. And personal not just because they want to go out drinking with you or something, but they have to just believe, okay, this person will be able to get it done. And let me also take it back a step and say, the bigger thing, even beyond that this person can get it done, right, is more when we talk about, hey, this change we want to create in the world, they aspire, you know, they want that change, right? The reason a lot of people, you know, reason a lot of people invest in a SpaceX or a Tesla or something like that is because they want, you know, we all want to be driving battery-powered cars. We want to be able to go to Mars. Like, those are things we aspire to. Whether that business works or doesn't work out at the end of the day, at least if you connect on the fact that that's the change you want to see in the world, that's the most important thing. And that translates to everything, and translates to any time anybody raises money. It's not because they have a better business model. It's just that people connect with you, and that's the change they want to see. A, that's the change they want to see. And then 2, do they like you? Do they believe you as a person can help get it there? And those are the only two things they can really bet on, because a lot of this is just very uncertain otherwise.
Right. Thank you, Biju. We've got time for just one more question, and so there's something that I wanted to ask. If you could share some anecdotes or advice for our student founders they're typically early in the process, either finalizing what their startup idea is, finding co-founders, or finding their first customer. Could you tell us a little bit about what it was like when you were first starting your company and how you really were able to start with good momentum and get things moving?
Absolutely. So I'd say the maybe if I was boiling it down to one thing, especially at IIT, okay, is that focus on selling. And why I say focus on selling, right? I think maybe there's a bias at an engineering school like ours that, okay, people will like just the technology, people like this, people like the merits of the technology, the merits of the model. But it's really all about selling. And the other thing is, it doesn't matter if you're not good at selling, right? You always find somebody else who is. And so focus on selling and focus on your team, and that it's the human-centered aspects of building a business, even if it's a very tech-centered business, that's going to help you win. Because for every tech-centered business, right, there are probably like 10 or 99 others that didn't make it because they didn't know how to sell and they didn't know how to get the right team. You could have a really good tech idea, but if you don't bring the right team and if you don't know how to sell, and this is coming from a tech founder, okay? So this, it's hard to make it. So because at the end of the day, building this company is about communicating your ideas to some investors, to some clients, and then to the world in general. So if you can communicate that, it doesn't have to be you, and it doesn't have to be you or me per se, but if you don't attract the right people alongside your cause who can communicate that, then it's hard to build a business. So I'd say that's the most important thing.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Biju. So I think it's just a very, very quick recap there that fintech is definitely not all about guys driving Ferraris and Lamborghinis, right? It's inclusive. It's about ESG and many other social impact, and lots of juicy advice from a veteran. So again, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.